Welcome back to our second segment of the presentation. My name is Andrew Mossman, and we're picking up where we left off. We're actually going to start getting into the nuts and bolts of the message. We're going to be going through the Bible. We're looking at the weight of evidence. Why did these people believe that Christ was coming back in the year 1844? What led them to stand? What led them to sell their homes, their businesses, and put all of their money into this movement? The fundamental principles of the Advent movement from 1840 to 1844 were widely distributed. The first was a doctrine concerning the new earth. Second was the millennium. It was a debate between premillennialists and postmillennialists. Premillennialists correctly maintain that the second advent takes place before the 1,000 years is found in Revelation. The third point is the restoration of Israel. The prophecies concerning the regathering of Israel have to do with the house of faith, or does it have to do with the carnal Jew? The fourth would be the signs fulfilled. Before you can even preach a message about the soon coming of the Lord, the signs would have to be fulfilling in that generation. And they rightly were, if you think of the stars falling, as mentioned in Christ's prophecy that was given on Mount Olives and found in Matthew 24. This met a perfect fulfillment with the celestial event that happened in November of 1833, perhaps the most remarkable celestial event that's ever happened in human history. So this really empowered the Adventists to go and preach, as they saw that it was their duty because these various signs had fulfilled before their eyes. The fifth point is the prophetic periods. In this presentation and these presentations, we will be looking at this pillar exclusively, and remember from what we've already learned that this is the basis of the message. This is what it's founded on. As therefore we are evidently at the very termination of the 6,000 years, that is, the 6,000 years would terminate in 1844. The 6,000th year of world history terminated in that year, and we'll show you how to do the chronology later on in the study. We are at the very point of time when all the honored names of antiquity would be looking for the coming of the Lord. Well then, may we live in continual expectation of this glorious event, when we find the fulfillment of the prophecies, the signs of the times, and the prophetic periods all harmonizing in the completion of this period. In other words, the prophetic periods are harmoniously terminating in this year. And one other point, we'll be looking at the 6,000 years in this series, but not in this particular video. So here are the 5 periods to 1844. A side note is that there is one prophetic period that ends in 1842, which we'll touch upon in this series. But the 5 periods are the 6,000 years, the 2520, the 2450, the 2300 days, and the 1335, found in Daniel chapter 12. So here's the famous broadside publication. If you were to go through this publication, you would see all the key periods that I have listed on the left-hand side of this slide. Here's a really interesting quote written in 1895 concerning one of the most important men that gave this message. I know that we have the truth, and one who had so decided a part to act in the proclamation of the first and second angels' messages is highly esteemed by me for his work's sake. This donation for Australia is gladly received from Elder Himes. It is more precious in my estimation than it would be if coming from any other human agent. Those are strong words. So what did Elder Himes believe concerning these prophetic periods? He spearheaded the publishing work, and he quotes the Missouri Republican on January 10th, 1844, and then he actually gives in the same edition of that paper, he writes something himself that's very, very similar. It is consequently not on one period alone that we rely, but on all the prophetic periods harmoniously terminating at about the same time, proved by conclusive evidence independent of the termination of each other. One striking evidence, Heim says, of the truth of the time when we look for the second advent of our Savior is the harmonious termination of all the prophetic periods about the year 1843, from the date of the Vulgar Era, from the year 4714 of the Julian period. So this is highly significant. Why are all the prophetic periods terminating in this year? Why is even the longest reckoning terminating in this year? Something momentous must be happening. And when they realized that all these periods were harmoniously terminating, this strengthened their faith that their calculations were correct, because in no way could that be some sort of accident. Now, Himes allowing the Missouri Republican to have a voice in his paper, they say, quote, "We regard the 7 times as one of our strong evidences, a prophetic period which is too important to be thus summarily disposed of. It is certainly deserving of a candid hearing, and should not be rejected without the weightiest reasons. We are as much astonished at the rejection of this period as we should have been had he rejected the 2300 days." So before we get into a Bible study on the 2520, we want to consider something very important. If you look on the timeline here, go to the far left where it says fall of 1831. That was when Miller first began to lecture. He first started sharing his views. Now, for the next 8-9 years, he was pretty much laboring by himself. He was laboring incessantly. He was even funding his own work, and he didn't have a tremendous amount of money because he was a farmer, and he wasn't receiving, he was barely receiving any donations, if any at all. And he was traveling in wagons and on railroad back in the mid-19th century. So his tour was very, very hard. But he was being sustained by God, and he was having a tremendous amount of success. But Litch got a hold of one of Miller's publications and was impressed by it, and applied Miller's application of scriptures using the day for year principle to calculate the prophetic periods. He applied them to Revelation chapter 9 and made a prediction that the Ottoman Empire, its power, it would collapse. It would cease to be independent in the year 1840. And we'll look at a quote. When he had predicted, his first prediction was that it would collapse in August of 1840, and on the 1st of that month, he doubled down. He didn't get cold feet, and he said it would happen on the 11th of that month. And lo and behold, the Ottoman Empire fell into the hands of the Christian imperial Western powers, and ended the greatest empire on the earth that it had been for the last several centuries. And this was important because it gave great impetus to the movement. And why do you think that might be? Well, if Josiah Litch was able to make such an impressive prediction come true based on rigorous Bible application, then what about all these prophetic periods that are based on the same methodology that would be terminating just a few short years later? And the implications of the terminations of those prophetic periods are much more significant. So this is why Litch's prediction gave such great impetus to the movement. allowing the first period, 150 years, to have been exactly fulfilled before Decoces ascended the throne by permission of the Turks, and that the 391 years and 15 days commenced at the close of the first period. It will end in the 11th of August, 1840, when the Ottoman power in Constantinople may be expected to be broken. And this, I believe, will be found to be the case. So fulfilled to the very letter. Absolutely amazing. Okay, now we've been looking in our previous presentation, the Second Advent Manual, and it gives just the vital points of the message. And the first of the prophetic periods in this book, which are considered as main pillars in the calculations of Mr. Miller, is found in Leviticus 26:18 through 28. For those that love history, Miller discovered this prophetic period came to its correct application before the 2300 days. Now, Litch, the same man that made that impressive prediction concerning the Ottoman Empire, says this about the 7 times. I have long hesitated on the 7 times, whether they are to be understood as a prophetic period, but after years of investigation and earnest study, I am constrained at length to acknowledge it as such, and have accordingly given it in this place. But I still look on the following argument on Daniel 8:14 as the strong bulwark of the cause. We're going to start in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. Now, if you read from the beginning of the chapter, it's dealing with a confederacy that's happening between the northern tribes and uniting with the Gentiles, the Syrians, to take out their brothers in the south. And so God issues this warning and makes a startling prophecy concerning Ephraim in the north. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years, that's 65 years, shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. So, this was a warning. This was a warning to God's people. And those in the south should heed this warning. This was in the first year of Ahaz, 742 BC. And this was on record for them. Ephraim was doing wickedly, and if they were to do wickedly too, they also would not be established. Hosea chapter 5, verse 5 makes a prediction, a prophecy to this effect. And the pride of Israel doth testify to his face. Therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity. Judah also shall fall with them. So if we go from 742 BC, and we go 65 years into the future from that point, we arrive at 677 BC. Now, God had prophesied through Moses that if they would break the covenant, if they would transgress the law, that judgments would fall upon them. He would bring the sword against them. You can find this in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus chapter 26 as well. You see on the bottom part of the timeline the various Assyrian kings that would end up attacking Israel. Israel loses their independence in 723 BC, and if you go a full 7 prophetic years from that point, 2,520 years from that point, it takes you to the year 1798, which we learned to be the time of the end. God's church would be in the wilderness until that time. And if you go a full 7 times from 677, it takes you to 1844. Remember that when Gabriel asked how long till these wonders, Christ answers with a times and a dividing of time, which takes us down to 1798, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. We're going to find out that was in 1844. So it's it's very amazing that if you date the 7 times, whether you do it from the northern tribes or the southern tribes, that takes you down to 1798 and 1844, based on when these two kingdoms cease to be independent. Now, Miller used Roland's history on some occasions to show that history and prophecy don't agree. Quote, 65 years afterwards, 677 BC, Esarhaddon, king of Assyria and Babylon, came with a large army into the land of Israel, and Judah carried away the last remnant of Israel, and they have not been a nation since. The Bible does have a record of this. 2 Chronicles 33 verse 9 says, So Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, and do worse than the heathen, whom the Lord hath destroyed before the children of Israel. Next verse. And the Lord spake to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hearken. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. Now, I'll actually hold off. This slide is going to make the comment that I was going to make. To find the commencement of the 7 times, speaking of Miller, he sought to find the period when Judah ceased to be an independent nation. That period he found when Manasseh was taken captive. Before this, whenever they were oppressed, they always recovered their independence. But from this period, they were never again independent. That the era of 677, we have only to refer to the margin of all polyglot Bibles, where the same date is given. Interestingly, in these polyglot Bibles, 742 would be found in the margin as well. So that date used to be in the Bible, so 677, and there's 65 years between them. And chronology also testifies that these dates are correct. So here's Gentile domination from 677 to 1844. In Lamentations, chapter 2, verse 9, we read, quote, Her gates are sunk into the ground. He hath destroyed and broken her bars. Her king and her princes are among the Gentiles. The law is no more. Her prophets find no vision from the Lord. So at this point in the Bible, we know that the judgments have come. We know that they're in the scattering time now. We know that the Gentiles are ruling over them. And if you go to Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 4, he prophesied that this would happen. Quote, I will cause them to be removed, or in other words, to be scattered. So let me put that word there instead. I will cause them to be scattered into all kingdoms of the earth because of Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem. So it was because of the sins of Manasseh. His leadership led his constituents to sin, his supporters to sin, and they would all be scattered because of what he did. Now, we already read this verse. Now let's read it with this understanding, that it was Manasseh's fault, that all Judah, would be scattered. So Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, and to do worse than the heathen, whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. And the Lord spake to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hear him. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. Now, a portion of God's last conversation with Moses on Mount Sinai is recorded in Leviticus chapter 26. Verse 1 to 13 is dealing with the blessings for obeying the covenant. When you get to verse 14, there's curses for disobedience. Now, at the end of the chapter, there's some hope. There's a reaffirming of the covenant. And that would happen at the end of the world. Now, if we examine the curses a little bit more closely, from verses 14 to 17, these are the first judgments that Moses warned about, and these judgments took place during the time span of the judges. And when did the children of Israel first apostatize? Well, it was during the time span of the judges. Now, when you get to verse 18, something interesting is said. And if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, what's all these things? Well, all those judgments that transpired in the time span of the judges. The Philistines would come and raid. They would take the Jews captive. And then God would raise up judges and overthrow their captors. And there was this back and forth in the time span of the judges. But now the denunciations are going to get more serious. And if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. So a prophetic period is being introduced. We'll see a scattering time is going to be introduced as we examine this prophecy more carefully. There's a length of time, there's a duration here being mentioned. He's going to punish them 7 times now because they wouldn't listen before. Verse 19 says, this is the first judgment enumerated under the 7 times period. And I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. Well, Manasseh was certainly the pride and their power of the Jews. He was their civil power, and he was their pride. And God had intended them to have judges. They wanted a king over them. And they wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted to be lifted up. And it was terribly humiliating when their king, when their leader was taken back into Babylon in fetters. And certainly his experience was like somebody whose earth was as brass and their heaven as iron. Imagine him in prison in a dungeon behind bars. This is when Judah would cease to be an independent nation. Their power truly was broken at this time. They never regained independence again. They were always ruled over Gentile nations from this point. So we see that the statue of Daniel chapter 2 is a representation of these 7 times, of judgments, Gentile domination. Now, Leviticus 26 is a delineation of various judgments that would come upon the Jews. And if you go 10 verses down, this is one that we're probably all familiar with. And ye shall eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters shall ye eat. This was fulfilled in the siege of Titus, 70 AD. The Jews really did eat their own children. Just read this verse, so I'm going to move forward, but this is Leviticus 26, 18 through 19. We have the first judgment enumerated under the 7 times period. Now, William Miller says of this period, it is evident that these, quote, 7 times, close quote, were a succession of years, for their land was to lie desolate as long as they were in their enemy's land. And the people of God have been scattered and are now a scattered and peeled people. These 7 times are not yet accomplished, for Daniel says, quote, when ye shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. It's true. When the ancient church was scattered, the Jewish people, under these 7 times, they went into all these different nations, and when we look in the New Testament in a prophecy of Revelation, God's people were still being persecuted by the Gentiles during the times and a half a time, which is 1260 years, which is 3.5 prophetic years and exactly half of these 7 times. When the dispensation changes, so does the subject of the dispensation. When the dispensation changes, so do the subjects of the dispensation. So, for instance, we have ancient Babylon in the Old Testament, but the Revelation prophesies that Babylon would fall at the end of the world. This cannot be talking about ancient Babylon because they have ceased to exist many centuries before. So it is a symbol, a representation for another kingdom. Likewise, the Jews, their house was left unto them desolate. They would not be regathered again. And when James writes in his epistle to the scattered people abroad, he's writing to the house of Israel. He's writing to the 12 tribes, to be specific. He's not writing to the carnal Jew, he's writing to the household of faith. That's why when you look at the 144,000 found in Revelation 7 and 14, these are Christians. These aren't of the Jewish faith. Now, when we look at Leviticus chapter 26 and Daniel chapter 12, you see that these two prophecies go together. Leviticus 26 verse 33 says, "And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw you out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate, and ye be in your enemy's land. Then even then shall the land rest, and enjoy her Sabbaths." So it is going to lie desolate as long as they're in their enemy's land because they're being scattered. So this is the context when we get to Daniel chapter 12, verse 6. How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? Daniel just saw a couple visions about beasts and a statue. These, again, are symbolically representing the scattering time. And Christ answers, "And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished." So we see that this scattering time has a termination date, and it definitely also has a commencement date, which we will discover is 7 times. Here is the timeline, and Daniel chapter 2 is a representation of a sacred calendar dealing with the scattering time. 7 times are repeated 4 times in the chapter. And you can pause the screen and write these verses down if need be and study them. Here's an interesting quote, a manuscript. "Lord does not repeat things that are of no great consequence." So why is 7 times being repeated 4 times then? Well, we get a principle from Genesis chapter 41, verse 32. Quote, "And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is become the thing is established. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass." So this is one reason why the 7 times is mentioned 4 times, because this is a very significant prophecy which is established. And it's interesting that God says, concerning the termination of the 65 years, where we find our commencement date for the 7 times, because the first judgment enumerated under the 7 times is prophesying of the same thing that the 65 years is, when Ephraim would no longer be a people. Remember, Hosea chapter 5 verse 5 says Judah would fall with them. And God says, "If ye shall not believe, ye shall not be established," by the writings of Isaiah. So that's another connection there as well. Now, this is a very deep interpretation of why the 7 times are repeated 4 times. But it is believed that there is still another, yet greater reason for its being thus repeated. That after the commencement of the 7 times, the Jews as a nation were to have 4 great opportunities of being restored to their former estate. And having the balance of the 7 times remitted, if they would hearken unto the Lord and be reformed by the punishments which they should then have endured, but if they would not hearken or be reformed by those things, they were yet to be punished the full 7 times for their sins. So let's read one of the clauses over again. The Jews as a nation were to have 4 great opportunities of being restored to their former estate, and having the balance of the 7 times remitted, if they would hearken unto the Lord and be reformed by the punishments which they should then have endured. Joseph and Miller have a similar interpretation when it comes to understanding prophetic time. Joseph interprets Sheba to mean years. Sheba is a Hebrew word. Miller interprets 7 times of Leviticus 26, and the Hebrew word is Sheba, to mean succession of years. Let's look at Genesis 41. We're looking at the left-hand side of the PowerPoint in the first column. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, we've used this text previously to give a very good reason, to give credence to why we understand the repetition of 7 times in Leviticus 26, 4 times, to mean that God is establishing a thing, to mean that this is not something that we are to just gloss over. He's repeating himself because it's very important that all 4 of these 7 times mentioned in Leviticus 26 are referring to the same period. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. And so I mentioned all of that because there is a connection between these 2 chapters. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. We're starting to understand that this chapter, Genesis 41, is very typical of the 7 prophetic years, the 2,520 years. These 7 years of famine represent something very, very significant, even beyond what was going on in Egypt in that time. You'll notice that 7 good, this is figurative, 7 good years, that 7, Sheba, actually represents 7 real years. Likewise, and if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins, as we read in Leviticus 26. These 7 times are figurative, they're prophetic, and the same word Sheba is used to represent that. So Miller and Joseph are in harmony with one another. Now, what you see on the screen here is tremendous history. That tent, that jumbo tent, was thought to be the largest in the world at that time. So the Adventists would come and set this up on the edge of town, and this would really excite people. This would spark their interest. Hey, what's going on over there? They would want to go and see. Now, this tent could sit somewhere around 4,000 people. And in 1842, Miller had the opportunity to preach in this tent. And Miller's doctrine is going out. It's catching like wildfire. And the secular press becomes very, very interested. This was this paper that you see over here on the left. This is coming out of New York. So this would be the equivalent of something like the New York Times wanting to know, hey, what are these Millerites preaching about? We've got to find out about their peculiar views. So they are promising to go in and give a non-biased account, to give an accurate portrayal of what the Millerites are like, what they're actually saying. We're going to look at a history account that writes some commentary on this report of the Millerite meeting. Quote, the second dispatch reports the arrival of William Miller and repeats that, quote, there is much more order, close quote, decorum, and good management in these Miller meetings than in the camps of other persuasions. No disorderly person, all, quote, quiet and decorous, close quote. After a prayer meeting, Litch delivers the morning lecture on the world's end about 1843. And after the noon meal, another prayer meeting is held. A hymn of the Advent faith, quote, the plain truth, close quote, is sung by three women, and then another appropriately called, quote, the last trumpet, close quote. Next, the big bell rings, and they all assemble into the big tent to hear Miller preach in his vivid style on the, quote, 7 times, close quote, of Leviticus 26, verses 27 and 28. A sizable portion of the address is given. The reasoning, the evidence, the appeals, even the interruptions and ejaculations are recorded. It is really a good piece of sermon reporting. So we can see that, again, whenever you look at the history and what the reporting of is from nonpartisans of Miller, they admit that the Millerites are very orderly, that there's no extravagance, that they're very sober, and that ultimately that it's the Orthodox faith that they're preaching. So these are good Christians. These are the best Christians actually in the land. And I also find it very interesting that that God, who I think it's becoming very evident for all, that he's in this movement, that he's leading this, and he has them in this jumbo tent so many can come and hear this very precious message. And he's impressing Miller, he's sustaining him. And when Miller message is really reaching out now to the broader public, that God is impressing him on his biggest stage to preach on Leviticus 26 on the 7 times. This is by no accident. This is by the order of God that he would preach on this particular doctrine. Therefore, it must be highly, highly significant and important. Now, the prophetic periods, as we've already learned from the Great Controversy, seem to point down to the spring of 1844. And Miller had never set a definite date. He just realized that all the prophetic periods are harmoniously terminating about the time of 1843, and he was going based on the Jewish year, which would start in March 21st, 1843, and end in March 21st, 1844. So it encompasses both parts of each year. And we are actually in March 20th, the very last publication before the Millerites would meet their first disappointment. Quote, for nearly a year, I have been settled and grounded in the belief of Christ's speedy coming. Still, almost every day brings new proof to my mind. And I am actually astonished at the repeated evidence from the Bible that about 1843 is the time appointed when the end shall be. I find that word astonished interesting. Miller, writing on the 7 times himself, those that reject it, he is astonished that they're doing that. This lady we're going to see is astonished just by the doctrine itself. And remember, we've already looked at a publication that Himes put out when quoting the Missouri Republican. They're astonished when people reject the 7 times. When people reject the 7 times, the Millerites are dumbfounded. Recently, from listening to Brothers Miller's lecture on Daniel 12, verse 7, I was led to study the Bible relative to the, quote, 7 times, close quote, part of which are referred to in the book of Daniel. The result has been the confirmation of my hopes by the light reflected from this single point. If we should yield up the 2,300 days and the 70 weeks. These, however, are but fractions of the 7 times. For as they begin 457 and the 7 times 677, the difference is just 220 years. Thus we see that none of the numbers in Daniel Thus we see that none of the numbers in the book of Daniel are arbitrary. all springing from the 7 times. Like streams diverging from a fountain, we have still one mighty immovable as the pillars of heaven. For the oath of the Almighty hath established it. And he certainly has. Remember in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 8, when referring to the 65 years that takes us to the commencement of the 7 times, God says, if ye shall not believe, ye shall not be established. And this is the very first pillar of Miller's doctrine. This was the first thing that he discovered in his personal studies. The next prophetic period that we're going to look at is based on the Jubilee cycle. It's the 2,450-year prophecy. So we're going to learn how to calculate that. And the Millerites believed that one jot or one tittle of the law shall in no wise fail. And when we're looking at these times of the Old Testament, like those concerning the feasts or the 7-year land rest, these Adventists believed that these times were typical. They were shadows of something. And it was only in this way that they could be fulfilled. They were prophesying of something that would happen in the future. So there's a quote from the Bible that we have on the screen. It says, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. And we're going to investigate this idea. The first pillar that we're going to look at is the 7th-day Sabbath. It was instituted before sin. It makes up part of the moral law. It's the 4th commandment found in the Decalogue. Second is the 7th week, and it goes with the third pillar, the 50th day. So from the Feast of First Fruits, when they would bring their barley offering, they would have to count out 7 Sabbaths. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. And that would take you down to 49 days from first fruits. And then the very next day, they would have a feast. It was called the Feast of Weeks. And the Feast of Weeks, after the cross, met its fulfillment. So there was shadows that were pointing even after the cross. We can see that Pentecost happened on that very day. Now we have the 7th month Sabbath. On the new moon of the 7th month was the Feast of Trumpets, and the trumpets sounded. We also have the 7th year Sabbath. They had to rest their land the 7th year. Quite a test of faith, not to grow any food in an agricultural society for a whole entire year. They would dedicate that year to spiritual pursuits. Then they would have to count out 7 times 7 years and a 50th year. So we can see again that 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. We see the pattern twice now. And what about an anti-typical Jubilee? In the type, on the 50th year, debts would be canceled, slaves would go free, inheritance would default back to the rightful owner. And these are all shadows of the second coming, when Christ is going to free us from this world and give us an inheritance, give us a reward. So how would we be able to calculate the antitypical Jubilee? The 7th year must be a shadow of something. Even time is a type. Well, the only criterion we're given is this 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. This 7 times 7 is how they calculated the type. And so for the antitype, we're just going to do the same thing. Instead of 7 times 7 years, we're just going to do 7 times 7 jubilees. We're going to do a jubilee of jubilees. So we have 7 times 7 jubilees, and that takes us, if we do that, that takes us to 49 jubilees, and there's 50 years in a jubilee. So we'll do 49 times 50. And you can see the computation, very basic, very simple, right on the screen for you. And it takes us to 2,450 years. Well, in all polyglot Bibles, the 4th year of Jehoiakim would be the year 607 BC. And many of the greatest chronologers maintain that that is the date. That's why it was found in the margin of the old authorized Bibles. And when you do the math from when the Jews were moved off the land, when Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar came and took the Jews captive, and the land was forced to rest, it would take you to 1844. Remember, in the prophecy of Leviticus 26, God is going to bring the sword against them, and he was going to scatter them, and the land was going to lay desolate as long as they were in their enemy's land. So here's a timeline, and I also have timetables for you where you can start counting Jubilees out from 607. And if you go 3 Jubilees, look with me on the timeline now. If you go to 3 Jubilees, it takes you to 457. And this is very profound, because in 457 is, as we're going to find out soon, is the 3rd decree of Artaxerxes, the last and final decree that went forward. And we learn that the Jews go back into the promised land at that time. And it's typical of the final gathering at the end of the world, when God would lead his people back into the heavenly Canaan. And how fitting is it that a Jubilee would fall on that year, that they would be led out of captivity, out of slavery on that year. It cannot be coincidental. God is ordering these things. Now we see God's hand over these things. And what we're going to learn now is that if you go 6 Jubilees from that point, if you keep counting your Jubilees forward, it takes you down to the years 158 and 157. 158 being the 49th year, and 157 being the 50th year. Now, if you go into the first book of Maccabees in chapter 9, historians maintain that this is the 158th year before Christ. And I'm going to read you a quote found on the bottom of the screen. Now, when Bacchus saw that Alchemist was dead, he returned to the king, whereupon the land of Judea was in rest 2 years. Now, this could only be the case. They could only be resting if they are keeping the Jubilee cycles, as written in the law of Moses. And we can see that, according to Maccabees, that they were in rest these 2 years. So the 4th year of Jehoiakim has to have happened in 607 BC. And that's great for us, because that's chronology agrees with that too. The best chronology points to 607 versus 605. This slide is going to go into the theology of the 2450 a bit. We're going to be quoting from January 10th, 1844. We're going to find out what those that gave this message said about it. Quote, "Many reject this period," referring to the 2450, "altogether, because it is only brought to view under the types of the Levitical law, and few rely upon it as such evidence of the advent within this Jewish year, 1843, as they do upon the other prophetic periods, chiefly being the 2520 and the 2300 days. If a few years' variation of this date could be shown, it would not materially affect the views of many as to the time." So maybe somebody was saying it's 604 or 605. Well, that would just be taking you to 1846 or 1847. Continuing the quote, "We, however, are forced to believe that no little importance," let's repeat that. "We, however, are forced to believe that no little importance is to be attached to this period. Our Savior has told us that not one jot or tittle of the law shall fail of being fulfilled, and the law can only be fulfilled in prophecy by the accomplishment of that of which the law was typical." So I'll repeat that statement. The law can only be fulfilled in prophecy by the accomplishment of that of which the law was typical. So we see this idea that time really is a type. It can't meet its fulfillment, as the Savior says, unless it's prophetically showing us something, unless it's shadowing us down to an important event sometime at the end of the world. Now, we're going to move on to our next prophetic period, the 2300 days. And I believe that Some, if not many of my viewers, those that will be seeing this, are pretty familiar with the 2300 days already. So I want to try to present this in a refreshing way. I'm going to give you an historical count of when Miller himself gave a Bible study on this prophetic period. The connection between the 70 weeks and 2300 days, this was a vital point to the chronology of Mr. Miller to bring the end in 1843. The Reverend William Hales, D.D., the most learned modern chronologer, that would be in the early mid-19th century, says, quote, "This simple and ingenious adjustment of the chronology of the 70 weeks, considered as forming a branch of the 2300 days, was originally due to the sagacity of Hans Wood, of Rosemead, in the country of Westmeath, Ireland, and published by him in an anonymous commentary on the Revelation of St. John in 1787. He elsewhere calls it, quote, the most ingenious of its class, close quote. I want you to think about something here. If this interpretation that Hans Wood discovered was the most ingenious of its class, and then Miller, years later, came to the same conclusion without the aid of any commentaries, and also came to the same conclusion, then everything that's said about Hans Wood by Reverend William Hales, the most learned chronologer, can also be said of William Miller. It is the most ingenious of its class. I think you're really going to enjoy this story about Mr. Miller. Quote, "As Mr. Miller's opinions respecting the nearness and nature of the millennium became known, they naturally elicited a good deal of comment among his friends and neighbors, and among those at a distance. Some of their remarks, not the most complimentary to his sanity, would occasionally be repeated to him. Having heard that a physician in his neighborhood had said that Esquire Miller, as he was familiarly called, was a fine man and a good neighbor, but was a monomaniac on the subject of the Advent, Mr. Miller was humorously inclined to let him prescribe for his case. One of his children being sick one day, he sent for the doctor, who, after prescribing for the child, noticed that Mr. Miller was very mute in one corner, and asked what ailed him. "Well, I hardly know, doctor. I want you to see what does and prescribe for me." The doctor felt his pulse, etc., and could not decide respecting his malady, and inquired what he supposed was his complaint. "Well," says Mr. Miller, "I don't know, but I am a monomaniac, and I want you to examine me, and see if I am, and if so, cure me. Can you tell me when a man is a monomaniac?" The doctor blushed, and said he thought Mr. Miller wished to know how. "Why," said the doctor, "a monomaniac is rational on all subjects but one, and when you touch that particular subject, he will become raving." "Well," says Mr. Miller, "I insist upon it that you see whether I am in reality a monomaniac, and if I am, you shall prescribe for and cure me. You shall therefore sit down with me 2 hours while I present the subject of the Advent to you, and if I am a monomaniac, by that time you will discover it." Doctor was somewhat disconcerted, but Mr. Miller insisted, and told him, as it was to present the state of his mind, he might charge for his time as in regular practice. The doctor finally consented, and at Mr. Miller's request, opened the Bible and read from the 8th of Daniel. As he read along, Mr. Miller inquired what the ram denoted and the other symbols presented. The doctor had read Newton and applied them to Persia, Greece, and Rome, as Mr. Miller did. Mr. Miller then required how long the vision of those empires was to be, 2300 days. "What?" said Mr. Miller. "Could those great empires cover only 2300 literal days?" "Why," said the doctor, "those days are years, according to all commentators. And those kingdoms are to continue 2300 years. So all commentators believe that these are years." Mr. Miller then asked him to turn to the 2nd chapter of Daniel, and to the 7th, all of which he explained the same as Mr. Miller. He was then asked if he knew when the 2300 days would end. He did not, as he could not tell when they commenced. Mr. Miller told him to read the 9th of Daniel. He read down till he came to the 21st verse, when Daniel saw the man Gabriel, whom he had seen in the vision. "And what vision?" Mr. Miller inquired. "Why," said the doctor, "in the vision of the 8th of Daniel." Quote, "Wherefore understand the matter, and consider the vision." He had now come then to make him understand that vision, had he? "Yes," said the doctor. Quote, "Well, 70 weeks are determined. What are these 70 weeks a part of? Of the 2300 days." "Then do they begin with the 2300 days?" "Yes," said the doctor. "When did they end?" "In AD 33. "Then how far would the 2300 days extend after 33? The doctor subtracted 490 from 2300 and replied 1810. "Why," said he, "that is past." "But," said Mr. Miller, "there were 810 from 33. In what year would that come?" The doctor saw at once that the 33 should be added, and set down 33 and 810, and adding them replied 1843. At this unexpected result, the doctor settled back in his chair and colored, but immediately took his hat and left the house in a rage. Next day he again called on Mr. Miller, and looked as though he had been in the greatest mental agony. "Why, Mr. Miller," said he, "I am going to hell. I have not slept a wink since I was here yesterday. I have looked at the question in every light, and the vision must terminate about 1843, and I am unprepared and must go to hell." Mr. Miller calmed him and pointed him to the ark of safety. And in about a week, calling each day on Mr. Miller, he found peace to his soul, and went on his way rejoicing, as great a monomaniac as Mr. Miller. He afterward acknowledged that, till he made the figures 1843, he had no idea of the result to which he was coming. On the slide, we have a picture of a Persian king. And Artaxerxes is buried in a tomb like this. We want to know when his third decree was, and the chronology varies, generally within a circle of 4 years. And some may say it's 454, others 455, or is it 457? And how do you know? Well, fortunately, again, it all comes down within a circle of years, and that circle is 4 years, generally speaking. So, which one is it, and how do you determine which one it is? You have this chronologer saying this, and another chronologer saying that. Well, it's by looking at all the prophetic periods, plural, as a whole. Remember when we were tracing down the 2450, we realized that there was a Jubilee year in 457. So that gives more credence to the year 457 than 454. That's just one example. But as you look at all of the prophetic periods and you study them deeply, you realize that 457 is really the only date that the third decree could have been issued. And even history, even the chronology favors that date as well. There's more evidence for 457 than 454, but you can make a case for 454. So we want to hone in. We want to hone in on the termination of these dates. And this is why a harmonious termination in approximately the Jewish year of 1843 was one of the striking evidences for their faith. This is the weight of evidence, the fact that there's multiple periods all terminating at this point. They weren't relying on one period alone. I'm going to give you an example of this concept in music. I'm actually quoting from 1841. This was dated April 15th. This is the Signs of the Times. Someone's writing to Brother Himes. Brother Himes, as the harmony of music or the harmony of chemistry depends on definite proportions, so the harmony of chronology depends on the proportions of its periods. That there is a chronological harmony can reasonably be doubted by none. Suppose in a piece of printed music some of the notes have become obscure, how is this time to be restored? A person without musical ear or science might set about restoring it by guess. But the harmonist might say, quote, this note in the air must have been a minor in order to agree with the corresponding note in the bass. If you place this note on that line, there will be a discord. Such, or analogous to this, ought to be our method in the doubtful or obscure parts of chronology. Suffice it to add that the harmony of a system of chronology is one principal evidence of its truth. History and prophecy doth agree. There is an harmony. We are given a weight of evidence. We're not given perfect truth, and we need to bring all the pieces together. So here is an illustration on the screen that depicts what that quote was speaking of. But let's say some of the notes had been obscured, they had been painted over, and we can't, or erased, and we can't see some of the notes now. How do we restore it? Well, it's by understanding the idea that music is based on definite portions. If there is a minor in the bass, then in order to make a chord harmonious and not discordant, you have to follow certain logical steps. The notes have relationships to each other. And that's how we're able to restore music. Now we're going to move on to our next point. It's going to be over the daily. This was a controversial matter in the Millerite era, although the leaders and the Millerites themselves were largely all united on this point, and it's going to be highly significant. This is Josiah Litch. What does he say? What the term daily signifies is a matter on which a diversity of opinions exists, and as it is an important word and much depends on the meaning of it, it will receive a careful examination. So much depends upon the meaning of it, and it's going to receive a careful examination. Josiah Litch is going to interpret this for us. Notice his commentary. The daily sacrifice is the present reading of the text, but no such thing as sacrifice is found in the original. This is acknowledged on all hands. It is a gloss or construction put upon it by the translators. The true reading is the daily and the transgression of desolation. Daily and transgression being connected together by and. The daily desolation and the transgression of desolation. They are two desolating powers which were to desolate the sanctuary and the host. And this is a true statement. Just go read Daniel chapter 8, verse 13 in the Authorized Version. The daily is the entity, the power that is trotting down the sanctuary or the host. And sacrifice is a supplied word. So we are not to think that daily has anything to do with the sanctuary system, typically or anti-typically. We need to get that far from our minds. So daily, as we'll learn, is dated from 508, and the two prophetic periods that date from there are 1798, the 1290, going down to 1798, and the 1335 going down to 1844. The 1290 and 1335 can only be dated from the same point. And here again, we see harmonious termination of prophetic periods. Now 1290 and 1260 are harmoniously terminating in 1798. Now this doctrine is getting stronger, and now we have another period. We have a fourth period that we're looking at that's taking us down to 1844. So it just shows you the beauty of chronology. Now, how did Miller discover the meaning of the daily? Quote, I read on and could find no other case in which the daily, was found but in Daniel. I then, by the aid of a concordance, took those words which stood in connection with it. Take away. He shall take away. The daily. From the time the daily shall be taken away, etc. I read on and thought I should find no light on the text. Finally, I came to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. When I had come to that text, oh, how clear and glorious the truth appeared. There it is. That is the daily. Well then, what does Paul mean by he who now letteth or hindereth? By the man of sin and the wicked, popery is meant. Well, what is it which hindereth popery from being revealed? Why, it is paganism. Well then, the daily must mean paganism. And the pagan imperial emperors were certainly trotting down the sanctuary and the host. The Romans were doing that, and they are the little horn of that prophecy in consideration. Now let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and let's read. Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him. So Paul is pleading that to them about the doctrine of the second advent. And he's saying that ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as the day of Christ is at hand. So even if we're writing to you that Christ is at hand, reject it. We're no longer inspired. If somebody is saying that or believing that Christ is soon to come in our day, they are a deceiver. Verse 3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God. We're learning about the papacy now, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So Paul is saying the papacy has to come onto the scenes in world history before we can even think about considering the second advent, before we can even think that Christ is coming soon. And remember that the papacy, it runs for 1,260 years. It persecutes God's people for that long, from 538 down to 1798. Then the time of the end happens. Then the little book is unsealed. Then the doctrine of the second advent comes onto the scene in world history. So this is a beautiful, beautiful harmony of scriptures here. Verse 5, remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things. So now Paul is referring to something that he had told to them privately. What was it? And why is he speaking like this? Remember when we were in that room together, we had this discussion? He's pointing them back to a conversation. Let's look at it. Now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. You know what's keeping the papacy in check. You know what's keeping him from coming onto the scenes in world history. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. There are some that are papal even now. There are some that are believing in pagan doctrine and clothing themselves with a thin veneer of Christianity. But only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. And then shall the wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. So one dark power needs to be taken out of the way before this other dark power can come onto the scene. And we know that Rome establishes the vision in the book of Daniel. We know that he is the main antagonistic power, and we know that he has two phases, as we see in the statue. There's the legs of iron, but then we have the feet, which represent churchcraft and statecraft. So the important thing to be mindful of is that Rome has two phases, and the Bible is continuously trying to educate us on this fact. In Daniel and the Revelation, this theme repeats itself over and over again, and this is what Paul's speaking of. This first phase has to be done away with before the second phase can come onto the scene. And the second phase, the papacy, has bearing on the second coming. The papacy is going to be destroyed by the second coming of the Lord. And why is Paul speaking so mysteriously about this power that would be withholding them? Well, remember, they were enemies of this power. They were enemies of the state. It wouldn't have been wise for Paul to say, and when pagan Rome, when the pagan emperors are taken out of the way, then the papacy will come onto the scenes. They had to write in code in order to protect themselves. And also, this is why Daniel chose such a mysterious word, daily. It just means continual. If he wanted to have referred to the sanctuary system, either heavenly or typically, he would have said daily sacrifices. He would have connected the word continual with something else that refers to the sanctuary, as he does in every other portion of the Bible, but he doesn't. In Daniel chapter 8, he intentionally omits something that has to do with the sanctuary as to help the reader not dwell on the sanctuary itself. Now, here's another angle that we can come from to prove what the daily actually means. On the screen here, we have Mr. Guinness, and he was comparable to somebody like a George Whitefield. He was a great evangelist. He led a revival that took place in the 19th century in Ireland that produced 100,000 converts. Mr. Guinness wrote a book concerning various theological positions that the Reformers had and the pre-Reformers had regarding the prophecies in the Bible. Quote, the fathers held that the Roman Empire was the, quote, let or hindrance referred to by Paul in 2 Thessalonians, which kept back the manifestation of, quote, the man of sin. This point is of great importance. The early church knew, he says, what this hindrance was. The early church tells us what it did know upon the subject, and no one in these days can be in a position to contradict its testimony as to what Paul had, by word of mouth only, told the Thessalonians. It is a point on which ancient tradition alone can have any authority. Modern speculation is positively impertinent on such a subject. As to the let or hindrance to the manifestation of the man of sin referred to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Mr. Eliot says, quote, we have the consenting testimony of the early fathers, from Irenaeus, the disciple of St. John, down to Chrysostom and Jerome, to the effect that it was understood to be the imperial power ruling and residing at Rome. Moving back to Josiah Litch, in each of the above texts, the evident meaning of daily abomination is the abominations of paganism in heathen Rome. Quote, the transgression of desolation, the abomination that maketh desolate, mean the transgressions or the abominations of popery, which have for so long a period made the church of Christ desolate and have trodden it underfoot. Can there be any doubt that this is the true meaning? What power trod down and defiled the sanctuary? If history be permitted to answer, it will proclaim Rome, pagan Rome. What power first authoritatively persecuted the Church of Christ? Pagan Rome. What power succeeded paganism, both in local situation and spirit? Papal Rome. Who has continued the persecution of paganism against Christians till now? Popery. Through what influence was paganism destroyed, or the daily abomination taken away, and the place of his sanctuary cast down? The influence of Christianity. Since the conversion of those pagan kings, pagan rites and sacrifices have not been known in Rome. Thus, quote, the place of his sanctuary was cast down, close quote, referring again to Daniel 8. Now let's look at the picture over to the right. We have the Pantheon here, and high above the floor, halfway up the building, you see these empty cupboards. Well, idols used to be there. Pagan gods used to be there. And that dome, that circle that's cut out in the top of the ceiling, light shines through there. The sun shines through there and lights up these pagan deities at certain points. These have been removed. They have been taken. Interestingly now, in the same city, we have the Vatican, and statues of like manner are found in the Vatican, and those were originally statues of pagan gods. So you see a similarity. Continuing the quote, soon after this, the man of sin appeared, and St. Paul's instruction to the Thessalonians was fulfilled. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. Quote, only he who now letteth or hindereth will let or hinder until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. The daily abomination was taken out of the way, and the transgression of desolation, popery, set up in its place. Now I'm going to refer to the Second Advent Manual, and I really like this interpretation, this history that's going to be used to prove the points in question. We looked at Josiah Litch, but now let's look at Apollos Hale. The idols of the nations conquered by the Romans were sacredly deposited in some niche or apartment of this temple, and in many cases became objects of worship by the Romans themselves. Could we find a temple of paganism that was more strikingly his sanctuary? Was Rome the city or place of the Pantheon, cast down by the authority of the state? Read the following well-known and remarkable facts of history. Quote, death of the last rival of Constantine had scaled the peace of the empire. Rome was once more the undisputed queen of nations. But in that hour of elevation and splendor, she had been raised to the edge of a precipice. Her next step was to be downwards and irrecoverable. The change of government to Constantinople still perplexes the historian. It was on an act in direct repugnance to the whole course of the ancient and honorable prejudices of the Roman mind. It was the work of no luxurious Asiatic, devoted to the indulgences of Eastern custom and climates, but of an iron emperor, born in the West and contemptuous, like all Romans, of the habits of the Orientals. It was the work of a keen politician, yet it was impolitic in the most palpable degree. Yet Constantine abandoned Rome, the great citadel and throne of the Caesars, for an obscure corner of Thrace, and expended the remainder of his vigorous and ambitious life to the double toil of raising a colony into the capital of his empire, and degrading the capital into the feeble honors and humiliated strength of a colony. So in this sense, we really do see his sanctuary being cast down, being moved from Rome to Constantinople, leaving Rome unguarded to be swarmed by the barbarians. The first outbreak in the East was followed by a still most important rebellion, in which Vitalian, whom Gibbon styles the champion of the Catholic faith, depopulated Thrace and exterminated 65,000 of his fellow Christians, close quote. So when we look at the picture of the right, that's a historical reproduction of what Constantinople looked like. And when the daily was taken out of the way in the year 508, that was the year that there was no more paganism. We see that we have Catholic supremacy now on the rise. Remember, there's these two phases, paganism and papalism. And do we find an event that helps support this idea that paganism was taken out of the way? Well, in this very year, Catholics started to murder 65,000 of their fellow Christians. What else happened in the year 508? Well, the history of France begins with Clovis. And Clovis was baptized. He made himself ally of the papacy and its protector, as well as that of the people. As the leader goes, so does the nation. So Clovis becomes Catholic. He subjugated the Arian Visigoths in 507 and 508. The ambassador of Antoninus, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, conferred on Clovis the insignia and the title of Council of Rome and Patrician. So now we see that a Catholic king is ruling Europe. is ruling the old Roman Empire now, and Clovis is putting on the purple. And so this is the first time a Catholic king of the West was the supreme power in Rome. And so supremacy of the Catholics begin in 508, and the supremacy of the papacy begins just 30 years later. Under Bishop Remigius, Clovis is going to marry Clotilda, and she is a Burgundian princess, and she helps spread Catholic dominance in a predominantly Arian realm. So we again see Catholic supremacy on the rise in 508. Paganism is out of the way. If you look at the borders, this is a map from 526. Only about 20 years after the taking away of the daily, 18 to be exact, and we're going to look at the territories of the former Roman Empire. There it is. Is there any paganism here in any of the states? Let's look. If you look at the pink on the screen, we have the Eastern Roman Empire. No, it's Catholic in 508. If you look at the Vandals, they are Arian, and Justinian would just 7 years later, he would overthrow the Vandals, and so they would become Trinitarian. But we have Arian, and we have Trinitarian. We have Christians there living, so there's no paganism there. The Visigoths over in Spain, they too were Christians. They're not Arian. They were Arians. They were not pagans. With the Franks as well, with the Burgundians as well. Look at the yellow, the Ostrogoths. They were Arians, so there's no paganism there. And so we can see very, very clearly that these are not pagan states anymore. These are Christian states by the year 508. And Clovis the Franks were the last to go. But I wonder if anybody's thinking, well, what about the Anglo-Saxons? They were pagans. And what about Britain? Because that was a Roman territory. What was happening in 508 there? So what was happening in England up until this time? Well, in British schools up until the 19th century, even early 20th century, you would have learned that King Arthur was actually a real historical figure, that he wasn't just some sort of legend or composite character. You would have learned about this. There was old manuscripts that they would have used to prove this fact. And I believe that this is the case, that in fact, the greater the legend is, the more likely that the person is not a composite character. So the greater the legend is, the more mythology there is surrounding a particular person, the likelihood increases that they're not simply a composite character, they're actually a real person. And so you see this with people like King Arthur and the Prophet Muhammad. Quote, having succeeded in this enterprise, one of his battles, he directed his course to York, where he is said to have established the Christian worship on the ruins of the pagan. Sounds a lot like Clovis. That he was the first Christian king, and that he was crowned by a Catholic bishop, and that his coronation was according to the papal mode in its more mature condition. Quote, Arthur was crowned by Dupricius, Archbishop of Caerleon. On the date of his coronation, there is a difference of opinion among historians. Some place it as late as 516, others place it in 508. Remember that when it comes to chronology, there's a circle of dates, and we're looking for some sort of harmony. The prophetic periods help us. The sacred chronology helps us to understand chronology better, and chronology helps us to understand sacred history better. History and prophecy doth agree. One is proving the other. So when we see two dates like this, we're like, aha, it's 508. It has to be 508 because this is agreeing with the other prophetic periods which we have already established. Now, Rapin, who claims to be more exact in his chronology of events in his history, dates them as follows. So generally, chronology even supports that which the Bible is supporting, generally the best chronology, that is. Here are his points. He mounted the throne of Demonium in 467 at the age of 15. In 476, he was created patrician by Ambrosius. In 508, he was elected monarch of Britain. And it was he that established the Catholic faith on the ruins of the pagans. So you have Clovis in France and you have Arthur in England. Isn't prophecy amazing? Now, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 8. We're going to go through the Bible verses now that concern the daily. Here is the interpretation. And out of one of them, this is speaking of Rome, came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, Egypt, and toward the east, Syria, and toward the pleasant land. That's Palestine. And there's this phrase, waxed exceeding great. Well, when it's speaking of the Medes and Persians earlier in the chapter, they wax great. And then Greece, the he-goat, waxes very great. And this is Alexander's, the notable horn from which these four horns, which we see on the screen, come forth. So Alexander waxes very great, the Persians waxed only great, but this little horn waxed exceeding great. And we can see that Antiochus does not meet the fulfillment of the prophecy then. Even if he meets it on other points, he has to meet it on all points in order for that history to be true. If one word lacks fulfillment, we need to look for another history to meet its fulfillment. And only Rome could be said to have waxed exceeding great after Greece. And so out of one of them came forth a little horn. This is Rome, and he goes towards Egypt. He goes towards Syria, and he goes through Palestine. Well, he comes up out of one of the horns. That would be Macedonia. He comes up out of the west. He conquers Macedonia first in 168 BC. He forms a league with the Jews in 161. Then he conquers Syria in the east in 65 BC. So he does move towards the east. He goes into Palestine and conquers Judea just 2 years later. And then 33 years later, he conquers Egypt. And it waxed great Rome, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. When we look in Revelation chapter 8, there are falling stars that represent, one represents Attila the Hun, another represents Muhammad, and so stars represent leaders. And therefore, when we look at Rome and who they were casting down and who are they stomping upon, and we're thinking, who is the host of heaven? Well, this must be God's people on the earth. They are his host, and the stars must be leaders among them. So this would be Jewish leaders. The next verse, yea, he magnified himself even to the Prince of Hosts. This is going to be Christ, and by him, this is the papal form, the daily, the pagan form was taken away. So you see these two forms in Rome, and there's a controversy here. And the place of his sanctuary, this is pagan Rome, was cast down. We learn that the capital was moved to Constantinople, and Rome was left defenseless against the barbarians. And a host, barbarians, was given to him against the daily by reason of transgression. This is the mystery of iniquity that's already working. Paganism is putting on a thin veneer of Christianity. So these barbarians would storm in to Rome. They were pagan at first, but by the influence of Christianity, this daily was being taken away. And now we see that they are just having a nominal conversion. They're just becoming Catholics. They're not actually becoming true Christians. And a host is being given to the papacy. And it cast the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then the next verse. Then I heard one saint speaking, And another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily desolation and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary, earthly and heavenly, and the host, God's people, to be trodden underfoot? So if the host is God's people here, then it's certainly going to be the host in verse 10. It's the same context. This concludes this segment of our presentation. Thank you for joining me. In our next episode, we will be continuing our study of the prophetic periods. God bless you.